So Charles had to physically stop a royal briefing because Princess Anne looked over, saw Camilla's family standing in a restricted part of the palace and basically said, "Why are they here?" And that one moment, just that split second of noticing something that didn't belong, completely unraveled this whole system of access that had been quietly building for weeks. What's wild is that nobody in that room had authorized what was happening, but it had been made to look so official that nobody questioned it until it did. That's the part that gets me. It wasn't some dramatic security breach with alarms going off. It was just family members standing where they shouldn't have been, and the entire royal machinery had to stop because of it. Before we get into the details real quick, if you're into royal drama, where the actual receipts matter more than the headlines, hit subscribe to Crown Watch. We break down the stuff that doesn't make the front page. Okay, back to it. So, here's where this gets weird. Charles had called this briefing for serious palace business. We're talking about Prince William, Camilla, senior officials, the people who actually make decisions about household access, ceremonial planning, residential arrangements, all the stuff that separates family life from royal duty. These meetings are not casual. They're closed, they're sensitive, and the attendance list is tightly controlled. Extended relatives don't just wander in. So when Anne looked past the closed circle and saw members of Camilla's family standing beyond the adjoining doorway, her instinct wasn't to smile and wave. Her instinct was to turn to her brother and lower her voice. "Why are they here?" And Charles didn't answer right away. His face tightened, then he raised his hand, stopped the senior aide mid-sentence, and the whole room went silent. He said the briefing would not go further until someone explained who authorized their presence. Now that's a big deal. Charles stopping a meeting like that in front of everyone over access. That's not normal. That's not just a husband defending his wife's relatives. That's a king recognizing that something had gone wrong at a structural level. And Camilla stiffened because she understood exactly what Anne was doing, and wasn't objecting to a family visit. She was questioning whether private access had crossed into official royal space and whether someone had moved that boundary without telling anyone at the table. William stayed quiet, but his attention shifted from Charles to Anne as a palace official checked the internal entry list. And here's where the system part comes in. The answer came back that special access had been approved under a household authorization category normally used for guests connected directly to the sovereign and queen. That phrase matters because the sovereign is the reigning monarch and anything attached to that office carries authority far greater than an ordinary invitation. So, these relatives weren't just guests. They were listed under a category that made them look connected to the crown itself. Charles asked who signed off on it. The official hesitated. Camilla looked toward the list and didn't, and studied the entry sheet again, and William saw the concern settle across her face. The problem wasn't simply that Camilla's family had entered the palace. The problem was that somebody had made their presence look routine, expected, almost protected by the system itself. Charles had stopped one meeting, but Anne was already beginning to suspect that the real story had started long before anyone walked through that door. To outsiders, the argument could have looked painfully simple. Relatives entered a palace and objected. Charles demanded answers, but inside the royal family, nothing about that moment was simple. Camilla saw people she loved and saw a constitutional boundary being blurred. William saw a precedent that might one day become his responsibility. And Charles found himself trapped between defending his wife and defending the rules surrounding his crown. The danger wasn't only what had happened, but what it could appear to mean. For years, he had tried to protect the private side of his marriage without allowing personal loyalty to interfere with royal responsibility. Camilla's children and grandchildren were part of his family life. Yet the palace was also a working institution where access could carry status, influence, and implied authority. The crown means both the monarch and the official system of royal power surrounding that role. If private affection began shaping official privilege, even unintentionally, the line could become difficult to restore and carried a very different instinct. Princess Anne has spent decades treating royal duty as something built on discipline, clear hierarchy, and rules that could survive individual personalities. She didn't believe family warmth should disappear, but she had little patience for arrangements nobody could clearly explain. That's why Camilla approached her after the suspended briefing with visible frustration. The queen consort asked whether Anne honestly believed her relatives were the problem, and held her gaze and answered, "Your family is not the question. Access is." Camilla said nothing for a moment, but the hurt was obvious. William chose his words more carefully when he later spoke privately with Charles. The prince told his father that whatever happened next could not depend on whether anyone personally trusted Camilla's family. A precedent, an earlier decision that can influence how similar situations are handled later, could survive long after everyone involved had gone. William warned that if unexplained family privileges became normal now, a future sovereign might inherit expectations nobody had ever consciously approved. Charles listened without interrupting because the future king was describing a problem much larger than one uncomfortable afternoon. Then Camilla admitted something that sharpened the tension. She had known members of her family would be inside the palace that day, but she insisted she believed the visit had been properly cleared and completely separate from the confidential briefing. Charles turned toward a senior aide and asked whether he had personally approved the authorization. The answer came quietly, no. Someone within the Queen's household had used standing access procedures without seeking direct approval from the sovereign, and immediately asked the question nobody wanted to answer. Was this the first time? Silence followed. Charles looked toward his staff instead of Camilla, and in that instant, the crisis changed shape. The confrontation was no longer about one uncomfortable afternoon because palace records were about to reveal the moment when an innocent family arrangement first became something far more consequential. Weeks before Charles halted the briefing, there had been another gathering inside the palace, smaller, warmer, and seemingly harmless. Camilla's family had joined her after a private dinner. Staff moved through the rooms without concern, and nobody publicly objected. But during that evening, one brief conversation created an informal arrangement that would later explode into the royal briefing crisis. And remembered it clearly because she had heard enough to know a boundary was being tested. Camilla had never wanted becoming queen to mean losing the people who had known her before royal life became so consuming. Her children and grandchildren remained part of her private world. And Charles understood that completely. He had no desire to turn marriage into isolation. Yet the palace was not simply a home. Household channels, the internal staff systems used to arrange visits, rooms, security, and schedules could turn a small convenience into something that looked far more official once it entered the system, and had already sensed that danger. Princess Anne had warned Accordia weeks earlier that repeated exceptions could become customs if nobody challenged them. She wasn't accusing Camilla's family of wrongdoing. She feared something quieter, that staff would become so used to helping them move through private areas that nobody would remember where the original limit had been. Camilla heard about Anne's concern and took it personally. To her, the criticism sounded less like caution and more like another reminder that her family would always be treated as outsiders. Then came the dinner that changed everything. 3 weeks before the suspended briefing, Camilla mentioned that visiting relatives were repeatedly being delayed at internal security points despite having planned invitations. A household official responded that a standing family access designation could solve the problem. A standing designation simply means an ongoing permission entered into palace procedures. So the same approval doesn't need to be requested every time. And passing the adjoining room heard enough of the exchange to stop. Camilla believed the conversation concerned smoother access to private residential rooms. She had no reason in that moment to think it would touch official spaces, and heard something more dangerous. The official told the queen consort, "Once it is entered, nobody should trouble them again." That sentence stayed with her because it sounded broader than a simple solution to repeated delays. Charles knew nothing about the exchange at the time and chose not to confront him without proof that anything improper had actually happened, but the authorization did not remain narrow. Somewhere between that dinner and the later briefing, the wording entered into the palace system became broad enough to allow movement near rooms used for official meetings. Whether that expansion came from carelessness or deliberate convenience was still unclear. What mattered was that Anne had now seen the consequence with her own eyes. She remembered the promise exactly. Camilla remembered the dinner differently, and Charles was about to discover that both versions could not remain unchallenged. The dinner had created the opening, but when Anne finally repeated those words in front of Camilla, private resentment would become an unavoidable royal confrontation. The door closed with no aides between them. Princess Anne remained standing while Camilla faced her from across a small sitting room. Both women knowing that this conversation had been postponed for years in one form or another, and didn't accuse Camilla of plotting anything. That almost made the confrontation harder. She simply repeated the sentence she had overheard weeks earlier and asked whether the Queen understood what had been created in her name. Charles had allowed the meeting because he wanted one thing stripped away before any decision was made. Misunderstanding. The king believed Anne and Camilla needed to speak without officials shaping their words or protecting either woman from discomfort. At the heart of the dispute was palace access, meaning the practical permission that decides who may enter private, working, or restricted royal areas. And made her position clear. She didn't care that Camilla wanted her children and grandchildren close. She cared whether family affection had quietly become institutional privilege. Camilla's restraint finally broke. The queen consort asked whether and would have reacted with the same force if the visitors had belonged to another branch of the royal family, and moved the chair aside but didn't sit. She answered that she would challenge anyone if private relationships began influencing official procedure. Camilla heard the words, but the wound beneath them was deeper. She told, and she had spent years feeling that every comfort connected to her own family had to be defended as if it was somehow improper. Then her voice hardened. She would not apologize for loving them, and refused to retreat, but she changed the direction of the confrontation. She repeated the words she had heard after the dinner weeks earlier. According to her own documented recollection given to Charles afterward, the household official had told Camilla that once the special designation was entered, her relatives would no longer be questioned. The phrase hit differently now. Camilla's anger faded because she remembered asking only for smoother entry during planned family visits, not for freedom to move near confidential working areas. Camilla answered immediately. She had never requested unrestricted access. She had never expected her relatives to appear near a royal briefing, and she had never understood that a simple request concerning private rooms had been entered into the system with much broader effect. And listened closely because for the first time, the two women were no longer arguing about motives. They were comparing memories. Then the same name surfaced, and named the household official she had overheard that evening. Camilla named that person, too. The room changed instantly. Their rivalry had suddenly become secondary because attention was shifting toward the person who had quietly turned a family convenience into a royal privilege. Charles returned to the briefing room carrying none of the warmth he had shown earlier that day. An access ledger had been placed before him along with the authorization trail that explained how Camilla's relatives reached the restricted corridor. The king read silently, reached the final entry, and set the papers down without speaking. William watched his father's face tighten. The troubling truth was becoming clear. Palace authority had been exercised without the crown fully understanding how far it reached. Charles read the authorization again, slower this time. Household officials could arrange practical entry for approved visitors, but sensitive working areas demanded tighter control because private residence and official royal business were never meant to blur into one another. A standing authorization in simple terms was an ongoing permission that could be recognized by palace staff without requiring a fresh approval every time. The Queen's household had enough administrative authority to request such arrangements, but the entire system depended on exact wording. One careless change could turn convenience into privilege. William leaned closer when he saw the category attached to the entry. It referenced the household of their majesties, a formal phrase used for the king and queen together. That wording made the authorization look as though it carried direct royal approval, even though Charles had never reviewed the expanded version. The monarch's frustration hardened. His name had not been written as a personal signature, but his authority had still been implied. William told him quietly that intent was no longer enough. If staff could create the appearance of sovereign approval simply because nobody challenged the process, then the system itself had become the problem. Charles asked for the earlier version. The answer changed everything. Records showed that the original request had been limited to scheduled family access in private residential areas. Later, one administrative revision removed the location restriction. That single change meant the designation could be accepted in a far wider part of the palace. It didn't explicitly say Camilla's relatives could enter confidential meetings, but it no longer clearly stopped them from reaching corridors connected to official work. William immediately asked who approved the revision. Charles already suspected the answer, the same household official, and had overheard after the private dinner had authorized the change, describing it in the internal record as a practical simplification rather than a new privilege. That detail cut through the remaining doubt. A minor adjustment had been treated as routine, yet its effect had been anything but minor. Charles made his decision without delay. He ordered the designation suspended immediately and summoned the official responsible for a direct explanation. No further exceptional access would continue until the wording, authority, and responsibility behind it had been reviewed. Camilla learned about the suspension before Charles had spoken to her. For the first time, the Queen Consort understood that this was no longer an internal argument about procedure. Her family was already feeling the consequences. A technical line had been corrected, but the emotional damage was beginning, and Camilla would soon discover what royal accountability feels like when it reaches the people closest to you. The consequence arrived without ceremony. One of Camilla's relatives approached an internal palace checkpoint later that day and was politely told that the standing family authorization had been suspended. No argument followed. No scene was created. Yet, when Camilla received a message, she sat motionless beside a small table, realizing that a decision made to protect the institution had landed directly on the people she loved and that Charles himself had authorized it. Charles had already ordered every exceptional access arrangement connected to her extended family temporarily removed while the household rules were reviewed. Future visits would have to be scheduled individually and limited to approved private areas. That mattered because the change did more than tighten security. It publicly restored the distinction between family guests and royal participant. The halted briefing was also reconvened under stricter attendance procedures, a clear signal that the king intended to correct the boundary rather than quietly allow everyone to forget why the meeting had stopped. Camilla felt the cost almost immediately. The Queen Consort received a call from a relative who had just been turned back from an internal checkpoint after assuming the previous arrangements still applied. She listened without interrupting, offered only a few quiet words, then ended the conversation. An aide remained nearby, waiting for instruction. Camilla asked to be left alone. The humiliation was not simply that access had disappeared. It was that the people closest to her now looked as if they had enjoyed something improper, even though they had believed the permission was legitimate. Charles entered later, knowing the conversation would hurt. Camilla told him she accepted the need for rules, but she hated what the suspension suggested about her family. The king answered that the fault belonged to the people who had created or expanded the authorization, not to relatives who had used it in good faith. She understood his logic, but logic did not soften the sting. For the first time, the crisis had breached beyond palace procedure and into their marriage, and heard about the suspension and refused to treat it as a victory. Princess Anne told William that if Camilla had never requested broad access, then humiliating her family would solve nothing. The prince agreed. He had already begun thinking beyond the immediate scandal. A rule aimed only at the Queen Consort's relatives would look like punishment, not reform. William then offered the solution that changed the direction of the entire crisis. He proposed one palace-wide standard for the private relatives of every senior royal, including his own. No family should receive automatic privilege simply because of personal closeness to the crown, and looked at him differently after that. Camilla's pain had exposed the problem. William's answer could finally remove it. What began as Anne's objection to one family was about to become something far larger. A test of whether the future king was willing to place his own household under the same limits. William entered without a private secretary, and Camilla dismissed her aide before he sat down. For once, there would be no official wording, no access lists, and no courtier deciding what either of them meant. Camilla expected criticism. Instead, William told her he wanted the new rules to apply to everyone, including Catherine's family and eventually his children's private circles. The statement changed the emotional balance of the entire crisis. William believed the only lasting answer was consistency. The prince wanted a clear distinction between royal relatives, private family guests, and people carrying out official duties. Institutional access in simple terms meant permission connected to the working machinery of the monarchy rather than ordinary family life. That distinction mattered because one privilege could easily become a future expectation. William knew that if the rule depended on who was liked, trusted, or married into the family, then the same argument would return again under another reign. Camilla listened, but her fear ran deeper than procedure. The Queen Consort worried that the entire scandal would confirm an old suspicion surrounding her relatives, that they were outsiders benefiting from her marriage to Charles. She told William they had never created a disputed authorization and had never asked to be treated as part of the royal institution. Then she asked a question she had been avoiding. Did he personally believe she had crossed the line? William paused before answering. He told her he believed she had trusted a system that failed to explain what was being done in her name. That was different from deliberately seeking special privilege. He then went further. The Middleton family, he said, should be subject to exactly the same standard. So should every private connection surrounding his own household in the future. Camilla looked at him differently after that. He was not isolating her. He was placing his own family under the same restraint. Camilla made her decision. She agreed to give up any remaining informal family access arrangements attached to her household and asked that future invitations clearly state whether someone was entering as a private guest or an official participant. The reform would hurt less, she believed, if nobody could pretend it had been designed only for her. William later took the proposal to Princess Anne. She approved immediately but added one condition. Charles had to own the decision himself, and warned that if the change appeared to come only from her or William, the public could interpret it as punishment aimed at Camilla rather than a rule protecting everyone. Charles accepted that argument. The king began preparing a household directive that would apply across senior royal families without exception. Then the crisis escaped the palace. The family had finally reached common ground behind closed doors, just as the world outside those doors discovered enough of the story to turn a private correction into a public royal storm. By morning, the secret confrontation was no longer secret. The image dominating public discussion was brutally simple. A king had stopped his own royal briefing after Princess and challenged the unexplained presence of Camilla's relatives inside the palace. Commentators immediately divided over what it meant. Was this favoritism exposed or proof that the monarchy could still police itself? Then one scene outside Buckingham Palace captured the public mood more clearly than hours of debate ever could. Camilla sat with Charles as the headlines repeated her family's name again and again. The Queen Consort had expected criticism of palace procedure, but not the feeling that her children had become symbols in a national argument they had never chosen to enter. Royal household procedures in simple terms are the internal rules that govern who may enter, where they may go, and whether they are present as private guests or in an official capacity. That distinction mattered now because the public was no longer debating a technical mistake. They were debating whether closeness to the monarch had quietly created privilege, and refused to retreat from the principle she had defended from the beginning. Princess Anne told William privately that she would not soften her concerns simply because the story had become uncomfortable. But she also admitted something harder. She disliked watching Camilla's children carry blame for an administrative decision they had not made. William agreed. The prince believed the scandal would only deepen if the monarchy allowed one family to become the villain instead of explaining the wider rule that it failed. Outside Buckingham Palace, the tension became impossible to ignore. Television crews gathered near the gates as visitors stopped to watch live broadcasts. One newspaper front page was held toward the cameras with the words "King HALTS briefing in Palace Access Row." Nearby, a member of the public told a broadcaster, "Same rules for every family. That's all people expect." The sentence spread quickly because it cut through the noise. The issue was no longer Camilla versus Anne. It was fairness. Charles understood the danger of allowing that argument to grow without a clear answer. The king authorized the household to confirm that visitor procedures were being standardized across senior royal households and that no extended family member would receive automatic access to official working areas simply through personal relationship. Camilla read the wording carefully and accepted it. William believed it went far enough to change the future. But Charles wanted more than a statement. He called Anne, Camilla, and William together one final time. The public had delivered its demand for fairness, but the decisive verdict would come inside the same palace where one raised hand had stopped everything. Charles looked across the room at the three people who had carried the crisis from beginning to end. Anne, who noticed the breach, Camilla, whose family became trapped inside it, and William, who insisted the solution could not punish one household while protecting another. There would be no more investigation to hide behind, and no more ambiguity to preserve. The king had reached his verdict, and this time, everyone in the room understood exactly where the boundary would stand. Charles approved a single-access policy for every senior royal household. Extended relatives could still be welcomed as private guests, but family connection alone would no longer create standing permission to enter restricted working areas or appear near confidential royal business. A unified access policy in plain terms meant the same visitor rules would apply across the monarchy instead of changing from household to household. That mattered because the crisis had exposed something dangerous. When personal relationships and official authority became blurred, even innocent arrangements could begin to look like privilege. Camilla listened as the king made clear that the rule would not single out her family. Catherine's relatives, Anne's family, William's private connections, and every other extended royal circle would face the same limits. The queen consort accepted the decision, but she asked for one thing in return. Her children should no longer be treated as symbols of misconduct when they had simply used access they believed had been properly approved. Charles agreed. He told her directly that they should never have been made to feel accused for a mistake created inside the system. Then he turned toward Camilla and ended the personal conflict between them. Princess Anne said she had never believed the Queen's family was the enemy. Her objection had always been to a privilege nobody could properly explain. Camilla answered without anger. She admitted and had been right to question it, even if the way the truth emerged had been painful. For the first time since the briefing stopped, neither woman needed to defend herself. Charles made the accountability final. The household official who had broadened the original authorization was permanently removed from visitor access responsibilities, and the old standing designation was abolished completely rather than merely suspended. No hidden exception remained. No vague wording survived. Then the king returned to the same briefing room where the crisis had begun. The attendance list was clear. Anne was there. Camilla was there. William was there. Charles placed his hand on the table and told the room to begin. That was the real verdict. Camilla had not been defeated. Anne had not won. William had turned a family dispute into a universal standard. While Charles proved that protecting his wife did not require protecting an unclear privilege. The monarchy had chosen one rule over personal preference, and the boundary that had once been uncertain was finally unmistakable.